Nigeria's premier financial institution, FirstBank, as part of its 125th anniversary celebration, hosted a lecture that brought together government dignitaries, royal fathers, business leaders, and stakeholders in the financial system. Focusing on the theme, Institutional Impact on Economic Growth and Improving Living Standards, it was an opportunity for a thought-provoking intellectual discourse on critical socioeconomic issues. The chairman of FBN Holdings, Dr. Oba Otudeko, gave the opening remarks at the event.
I want to use this opportunity to celebrate with all of us for being privileged to be here on a day like this. 125 years in the life of any institution is extremely remarkable. Much so of a banking institution. Those who know the industry of banking can well appreciate the risks that attach to the industry. We have passed through phases of history, cycles of economic ups and downs, and we are here today standing. Thanksgiving to the Almighty God who has made it possible. And I want to sincerely appreciate all those who've been part of this long history. Our former staff, our former directors, all our customers, and all those who make us who we are today. This is part of our celebration. And I want to say we are doing this on behalf of all of us. We are doing it on behalf of Nigerians. We are also doing this to continue to remind you that our assignment, the assignment that you have given us, is in good hands.
Keynote speaker, Professor Daron Asemoglu of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, gave insight into the role of inclusive institutions in driving high-quality economic growth.
I want to talk about democracy for 3 reasons. One is that it is imperfect but still critical. Second is that it is under renewed attack, and the nature of its benefits are underappreciated and belittled. A big, big mistake that I want to act as a partial corrective to. According to the Freedom House, the last 12 years, the number of countries where democratic institutions and respectful civil rights and civil liberties has gone back, every year has exceeded those in which there has been improvements. This does not look like the age of democracy or the end of history. It looks like the retrenchment, slide of democracy. But then the narrative continues. Democracy is problematic. In this day and age, perhaps you need firm leadership. You need leaders who impose their will, make the right policy choices, and avoid the hurly-burly of democracy. In China, in Africa, you hear that rhetoric a lot. Even in the US nowadays, you hear that rhetoric a lot. China, Russia, they are acting more and more like role models for many countries. Yes, democracy is something that you may want to enjoy, but it's become more costly. If you want economic success, don't go down the path of democracy, especially for developing countries. I want to argue that that's wrong. It's very wrong. In fact, the data speak very loudly on this point. I'm just going to show you the data. That's it. That's the data. What this is, I'll tell you, it's very easy. I've taken every country, every year, from 1950 to 2015, and classified them as democracies or non-democracies. The year when a non-democracy becomes a democracy, that's year 0. And then I plot their GDP per capita, how much goods and services they're producing, relative to other countries in that year. So this is like a transparent summary of what goes on. around democratization. 0 is where you democratize. There are two things in this figure that are particularly noteworthy. One is that look at countries just before 0. That's that big slide down, the big cliff. There is a reason for that. Non-democracies don't go away peacefully and out of their own volition. The Chinese Communist Party or Putin in Russia or military dictatorships in West Africa or the rest of Africa, they don't go by saying, okay, we've had enough. We think democracy is going to be much better. We'll just put ourselves out of the way. No, they go when they lose legitimacy, when the opposition to them mounts, and that happens most strongly and forcefully in the middle of recessions. Dictatorships typically fall when their mismanagement of the economy becomes so overwhelming that the economy tanks. That's a big drop there. And then they have no choice, but in the face of the demands from society, they make way for something else, typically democracy, but sometimes other dictatorships. But the second point is much more important for, if there's going to be another second takeaway from my talk, this figure is it. After a few years, those that democratize start growing faster. And by the end of about 25 years, the dividend from democracy is about a 25% higher GDP per capita. There is no evidence, I'm not showing you, there is no evidence for any country, developed or developing, that democracy has been associated with lower growth. Of course, China grows more than France, but that's not fair. That's apples and oranges. The question is, will France grow faster if it became a dictatorship? Will Nigeria have grown faster if it remained a dictatorship? Those are the questions. And democracy, as part of the bundle of inclusive institutions, is critical, but just by itself, even if you don't fix the rest of the institutions, it brings enough dividends of 25%. That's a huge change. It's not going to make Nigeria Switzerland, but it is the first step. Then build on it with other institutions and it changes. And why does democracy bring this growth? It's actually important to understand that. There are a couple of things. The first is that democracy brings productivity improvements, and it does so because it's actually better at getting rid of the worst regulations, those that create oligarchies and monopolies and corruption, than dictatorships. Second, democracy does one thing that its opponents really don't like. It raises taxes. Tax revenue, and I will come back to this. Tax revenue is a lifeblood for developing countries. Developing countries need infrastructure. They need education, they need health. Those are not cheap. But if the government doesn't have legitimacy, if it doesn't want to tax its cronies, and if it cannot overcome informality and illegality, that it cannot raise taxes, it will not have the revenues to do that. You need a social pact to increase taxes. And those taxes are then going to be the lifeblood for future growth. And in fact, what democracies do typically, there are exceptions, but typically what they do is that they raise taxes and they invest those things in education and health. And you see what happens to infant mortality after democracy. It's like a huge-scale health program. It's like an amazing decline in health, infant mortality after democracy. Why? Because once you democratize, you start spending on health services in parts of the countries that were completely ignored by non-democratic regimes. So much of a good thing. Why aren't we all democratic? Why aren't we embracing it around the world? Well, many reasons. First of all, not everybody loves democracy. If you are the Chinese Communist Party or a military dictator in Africa or Latin America, you don't love democracy. Democracy means your privileges are taken away from you. If you're a crony of one of such person, you also don't like it.
The scholar advised the Nigerian government and policymakers on steps that should be taken in the area of the economy and international trade.
Nigeria isn't an island. We live in an international world. But it's the same lesson, my last lesson. The international dimension is also for us to decide how to use. Of course, I'm aware, I'm not completely unaware. Nigeria has a painful history of colonialism, foreign interventions, imperialism, slave trade, everything. That is an example of not taking from the international community being allowed to impose its worst parts on a country. But it's no different today. You can decide to follow investments made on unequal terms. You can decide to follow advice to strengthen the military, weaken democracy. Or you can decide to take the international dimension in the way that it comes best for the country. And again, society has to decide. That means, in my opinion, take technology. Technology is key. Productivity growth comes from technology. Nigeria cannot realize its potential in the next 25 years in the same way that it has started making progress unless technology improves. And that technology is going to come from abroad. It's going to come with foreign capital. It's going to come with joint ventures and technical expertise. It means take investment from every country, but on your own terms. Don't let China dictate it. Don't let China tell you what to do. And it also means, and this is very important, take criticism. Take criticism. Take criticism. Not every international reaction to Nigeria is because Europeans or Americans or others are becoming imperialistic again. Turkey, the country where I was born, went off the rails because when Europeans started criticizing its lack of progress on human rights, they said, no, we're going to defend ourselves and we're going to buckle down. And it was hell. Take criticism. If the international community, if Amnesty International, if Transparency International says there is corruption here, don't dismiss it. Take it to heart. Because to deal with corruption is very essential to build that trust. Build that trust, build that expertise, then you can start collecting more taxes, using them in the right expertise, and investing in health and education for high-quality growth. Thank you.
Professor Asemoglu speaks further on the central thrust of his lecture.
I think Nigeria has to be ready to welcome all investment, but in its own terms. In the same way that you don't want to dictate Europeans to what to do, the same thing for the Chinese. I think if China brings capital on terms that Nigerian society, not just a few people at the top, but Nigerian society is welcoming, that's great. Same way with Americans, same way with Europeans. I think technological hunger and commitment to expertise, human capital, and improving productivity and the lives of the people in Nigeria, those are the driving forces that should be guiding everything.
For the Managing Director and Chief Executive of FirstBank, Dr. Adeshola Adeduntan, the lecture was apt and keyed into the phase of preparations for the second term of the President Muhammadu Buhari administration.
The lecture, the way I look at the lecture is that it's FirstBank's own contribution to the discourse on national development and growth. I think the fact that we have a number of policymakers here today, the Minister of Finance was there, the Minister of Power, Works and Housing was also here, also implies that the feedback will go back to the government and it will also serve as an input into the next level, which is the next agenda of the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
From the 125th anniversary celebration lecture of FirstBank, it is clear that with inclusive institutions, alongside investments in human capital and technology, nations like Nigeria can attain high-quality economic growth.